This is the Lou Rockwell Show.
Dr. Hans-Hermann Hoppe is a senior fellow of the Mises Institute, was professor of economics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, author of many important books, The Economics and Ethics of Private Property, for example. Hans also an expert on the state. Murray Rothbard once described the state as a gang of thieves writ large. And if you think of it that way, obviously there's a vast propaganda effort by the state and the people on its payroll, or the people who would like to be on its payroll, to convince us all that it's perfectly legitimate for what is essentially a parasitical organization to live off the rest of us at a very high style, to kill us, to tax us, to conscript us, to loot us in general, control us. Hans, how is it that such a thing can take place? How is it that human beings allow the state to exist and to rule and even love it and bow down to it and have almost religious feelings towards it?
If you look at the central argument in favor of the state, it is very easy to recognize that there is a fundamental flaw involved. So it is really a miracle that the state got off the ground. The argument in favor of the state is simply this: there exists scarcity in the world, and because there exists scarcity in the world, conflicts are possible between different people. What do we do about these conflicts that break out? How do we create peace among people? And the proposal that is made by statists from Thomas Hobbes on to the present was, because there are constantly conflicts going on, contracts among various individuals will not be sufficient. What we need is one ultimate decision maker who decides who is right and who is wrong in every case of conflict. And this ultimate decision maker in a given territory, this monopolist of ultimate decision making in a given territory, is defined to be a state. Now, if you think about this, the flaw in the argument becomes apparent once you realize that if there is an ultimate decision maker in every case of conflict, then the implication is that there must be that this institution also rules who is right and who is wrong in cases of conflict that this institution itself has with other individuals. That is, it is not only an institution that decides who is right and wrong in conflicts that I have with someone else. It is also deciding who is right and wrong in cases where itself is involved in conflicts with others. And once you realize this, then it becomes immediately apparent that such an institution can itself cause conflicts, and then decides, of course, in its own favor who is right and who is wrong. That can be illustrated in particular by institutions such as Supreme Courts, for instance. If we have a conflict with some governmental entity, the ultimate decision maker, who is right and who is wrong, the state or I myself, this is decided by Supreme Courts or constitutional courts, and constitutional courts are part of the same institution with which I have a conflict, and of course it is then easy to predict what the outcome of this conflict arbitration will be. It will always be, I, the state, am right, and the people who complain about me are wrong. It is a prescription for increasing the power of this institution continuously, causing conflicts and then deciding in favor of itself, and then telling the people who complain about the state how much they need to pay for these judgments that are made by the state itself. So it is easy to see what the fundamental flaw in the construction of an institution such as a state are.
And so, Hans, this is why we've had this seemingly unstoppable increase in state power, certainly since, in America, ever since 1776. So is there any hope? Is the state all-powerful? Is there nothing that can stand against it? Is there no way to oppose it?
The first thing, in order to oppose it, has to be, of course, the insight into the nature of the state. It is curious that economists in all other areas are against monopoly and in favor of competition. They are against monopoly because, from the point of view of consumers, monopolists will be institutions that produce at higher than minimum costs, and the quality of the product will be lower than it otherwise would be. And competition we regard as good from the point of view of consumers, because competing firms are continuously striving to lower their production cost, pass on the lower production cost in the form of lower prices to consumers in order to outcompete their competitors, and of course produce the most highly quality products possible under given circumstances. The curious thing is that when it comes to the most important matter in human life, namely the protection of life and property, there, curiously enough, almost all economists are in favor of having a monopoly providing this particular service, and seem to think the argument no longer applies, that a monopoly will require far higher expenses in order to produce whatever they produce, and the quality of the product, in this case law and order or justice, will be lower. So at the beginning of any type of rollback of the state has to stand an insight into the nature of the state as a monopolist, and an insight into the negative effects that monopolies have in all walks of life, and in particular in the area of law and order. What we can hope for at the best is that the number of competing states should be as large as possible if we don't succeed to abolish the state at all. A larger number of states does not allow states as easily as they would like to increase taxes, to increase regulations, because people will then vote with their feet. The most dangerous situation that one can imagine would be a world government that imposes the same tax and regulation structure on a worldwide scale, taking away any incentive for people to move from one place to another, because the tax and regulation structure is the same everywhere. On the other hand, if we would have a situation where we have tens of thousands of Liechtensteins and Switzerlands and Monacos and Hong Kongs and Singapores, then even though each individual state might want to increase taxes and regulations, they simply cannot get away with it without immediate repercussions, namely people moving from less favorable locations to more favorable locations.
Hans, when we think of thinkers like de la Boétie, Hume, Mises, Rothbard, they all pointed out that as impregnable as the state seems, with all its armies and its vast numbers of employees and the vast propaganda apparatus, that it actually is vulnerable because the state, as a minority parasite depending on the majority, depends on the consent of the governed. And to the extent that people withdraw their consent, even the most powerful state, as we saw in the Soviet Union, as we saw under the Shah in Iran, British rule in India and other instances, even the most powerful state can crumble. So is that also a hope of ours?
Of course. Again, the point here is that the president can give an order, but the order must be taken up and executed by a general. The general can give an order, but the order has to be executed by some officer. The officer can give an order, but the soldiers ultimately have to do the shooting. And if they don't shoot, then whatever the president says or the highest commander says has absolutely no effect. In this sense, states can only execute their policies if people lend them their voluntary consent. They might not agree with everything that the state does and orders them to do, but they are obviously, as long as they cooperate, of the opinion that somehow the state itself is a necessary institution, and the few mistakes that they perceive are the necessary price that must be paid in order to maintain the overall goodness that the state produces. Once this illusion disappears, once people recognize that the state is nothing else but a parasitic institution and no longer obey the orders that are issued, then all the powers, even of the most mighty despot, will immediately disappear. But in order for that to be possible, it is first necessary that people develop what we might call a class consciousness, not in the sense that the Marxists think of class consciousness, that is, that there is a conflict between the employers and the employees, but a class conflict between, on the one hand, the state rulers or the ruling class and the state subjects. So the state has to be perceived as an exploitive, parasitic institution, and only then, if we have a developed class consciousness of this kind, is there any hope that by withdrawing consent from the state, that the state might ultimately collapse.
I always liked Hobbes's point, or rather enjoyed Hobbes's point, that one of the things that threatens the state is humor and laughter. You're supposed to respect them, take them very seriously. He said it was a very dangerous thing if people were laughing at the government. So I think I'll just leave everyone with the important injunction, laugh at the government. Dr. Hoppe, thanks so much, and I want to again mention his book, The Economics and Ethics of Private Property. Take a look at his archive on LouRockwell.com under columnists. All his articles are very much worth reading. At the bottom of the articles, you can click on his book covers and buy these books. Hans, thanks very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lou Rockwell Show, produced by LouRockwell.com, the best-read libertarian website in the world. If you'd like to advertise on this podcast or on the website, email advertise@LouRockwell.com. And thanks for listening.